This is Monica Perez, and we are back reading this book that people are loving, Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas P. Neal. And we've gone through quite a few of them. We are up to the second half of the one on Bentham. So, if you recall, Jeremy Bentham is the mastermind behind the Panopticon, which we all feel, I think a lot of us feel like we're living in the Panopticon, which was a prison of his devising that would have a bunch of cells around a central watchtower. And the watcher, if they saw you doing anything wrong, they would shoot you, basically. I don't know if his works exactly like that, but the modern, I've heard it described in a modern way. I don't know if he had this idea either, but you don't even need to have somebody in the watchtower, and you don't need to see if somebody does something wrong. If you just pick somebody off every once in a while, everybody else will stay in line. It's kind of a very, it's a scalable psychological prison. And people think that we're in it right now, being constantly watched, or at least think we are. So anyway, let's get on with the reading, and also my shocked commentary sometimes at like what these guys who are devising the modern mind, whether they knew it or not, what some of them were thinking. Yikes. Okay. So hopefully you've heard the first half. If not, just zip over to my podcast feed or the YouTube video on the first part of Bentham. Okay. The association principle, in quotes, this is part 4, was an essential element of the utilitarian system because Bentham and his associates were going to make men automatically good and happy. It is implicit in all Bentham's writing, but the psychologist of the group who worked out the principle of association to explain all mental activity was James Mill. So this guy, Thomas Neal, the author of this book, he has nothing but praise for John Stuart Mill. He's not a huge fan of his dad, James Mill. Okay, he says, James Mill's analysis of the phenomena of the human mind, published in 1829, was not widely read at first, but it convinced all utilitarians, so much so that the next generation of the school republished the work in 1868. It remained the ultimate explanation of mental activity for Englishmen and Americans until the experiments of Pavlov and Watson substituted a biological for a mental causation. Interesting. See, and in my mind, all of this stuff is just replacing the church and or even Greek philosophers. So my uncle, who's a priest, gave me a book called Plato, Not Prozac, and also Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy, neither of which I read. So maybe it's time. Maybe when you live in the ruins of a destroyed civilization, as I have been ever since this crazy fire, you need the consolation of philosophy. So I may dip a toe after all these years. Anyway, but these guys are replacing this wisdom, this classic wisdom from the ancient time, and also the Catholic and Christian wisdom that is, I think, displaced. This book, remember, starts with Luther. Okay, Mill attacks his problem of explaining how the mind works in characteristic rationalist fashion. The problems of philosophy, he explains, are all very simple if they are attacked scientifically. So he makes use of the newly developed science of chemistry to explain the origin of ideas. Davidson aptly labels the doctrine of association mental chemistry. They tell you that with all this psychopharmacology, that it's, it's a chemical imbalance. It's like, really, chemical imbalance, but I can still thread a needle? Okay. Anyway, the explanation of the mind to him, Mill, was just the exposition of the mode of combination and coalescence among its varied states, and what transformations this process could affect. Yeah, I mean, that's like physics. Everything's physics. Okay, ideas are atoms. Psychology is the study of laws under which they combine into mental molecules. I mean, it's not totally not true. You know? Electrical, see, that's the thing, though. Electrical, right, is basically light. Light, they're not even sure what it is. They say it's mass and energy or particles and waves, whatever. Okay. Well, then it's only just some of it is particles, some of it is waves and whatever. So it can't be the whole story. I think we have not discovered the whole story yet. All ideas, Mill explains in Humean fashion, are copies of sensations. All knowledge results from the association of these transformed sensations, associations which are made in time and place. Mill uses the example of thunder following lightning so regularly that we come to associate the two of them in causal relationship. In the same way, the word man comes to arouse in us the idea of a human being simply because the word and the idea have always been so closely associated in the mind. Mill therefore concludes the fundamental law of association is that when two things have been frequently found together, we never perceive or think of the one without thinking of the other. This is good as an explanation of some mental activity. But Mill concludes that he has hereby explained everything the mind does. His psychology is as naively simple as that. The analysis, Mill's book, is thoroughly nominalistic. Do you remember that as positive? Oh, that's normative versus positive. Okay, nominalistic, naming things. Mill insists that names, such as man or duck, are nothing more than tickets or labels placed upon objects that can conveniently be put into the same pigeonhole. Classification is simply a process of naming, and prediction is merely the substitution of one name for another. The predicate is always implied in the subject. Thus, when you say that man is a rational animal, you are really not saying anything of man. You are only saying that these are two names which you have attached to a certain class of creatures. Leslie Stephen can therefore conclude in his study of Mill that his analysis of the mind seems to get rid of the mind itself. It is not much more than a mechanical grain grater, which automatically separates the kernels of grain into various compartments. But more important from the utilitarian point of view, Mill gets rid of free will as a bit of absurd nonsense concocted by moralists in days gone by and accepted by people who did not understand the chemistry of their own minds. This is so freaking interesting to me. I've told you this before. It's my problem with Einstein. When I was a kid, I remember saying if God or if a person knew all the position of all the atoms in the universe and all the laws of math and science, would you be able to predict the future? And the answer is no, because they would say now quantum theory. I don't know if quantum theory is right or wrong, chaos theory, whatever, but it does allow for that uncertainty. And that uncertainty is required for free will to be possible. And we're told free will, of course, if there's any kind of moral retribution or anything like that, any crime or any rewards or punishments, in a cosmic sense after death or whatever, you have to have free will. You can't be punished for something you were compelled to do. So this is why Einstein did not accept, according to the book by Walter Isaacson, so take it for what it's worth, that chaos theory or quantum physics, because he said that would imply free will, and I don't believe in free will. They're fatalists. You have fate. The human mechanism of the mind, a rather simple calculating machine for Mill and his associates, explains all knowledge, all decisions, all muscular activity. Can you guys hear that dog? My freaking dog. Can you hear the dog? I can shut him up, but I don't want to stop. Okay. The law of association controls the working of this human machine. The only points of entry for bettering the world, therefore, are two. First, each man's mental mechanism, which must be perfectly adjusted so that it operates with automatic precision on the transformed sensations fed into the mind. Second, the outside world from which sensations derive, which must be changed so that the matter entering the mind is sifted, winnowed raw material. The utilitarians, therefore, believe that in a world of flowers and trees, birds and bees, happiness would not only be possible, it would be inescapable when men's minds operated properly. So for them, happiness is at hand. I have to let Arturo in the room because he's just going to bark. Hey, buddy. You ever switch my mind? Arturo. What a good boy you are. Come here. Come here. Lay. 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 Okay. I heard you have to tell them to do something. I'm training him. It's not being very successful. All right, we'll have to edit that. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so, but what is happiness? Yes, I noticed this. I know. Have I mentioned this to you guys before? I noticed this under the Obama era, and I remember commenting on it that the theory seemed to be if you change the world, you change the man. So this fantasy that socialism could work has to, because this was my idea about socialism, that if people were altruistic enough that socialism is not slavery and theft, if they really want to give everything away, and they would still work if they you know, everything to whom from everyone according to their abilities to everyone according to the need, then they'd be altruistic with their own stuff. So you have to really change the nature of man to make incentives not matter, whatever. And I felt like under Obama, they wanted to change the world to change the man. And I'm going to attribute it to the Benthamite utilitarians. So, okay, so but what is happening? The answer to this question served as the second basic principle of the Benthamite school, and it earned them the then derogatory tag of utilitarian. Bentham had an easy, simple answer for the question. Happiness is pleasure, pain is its negation. I might say the opposite. Have you ever been in pain and taken an oxy? You have never been happier. I think it's the opposite. Every act, he tells us, by which pleasure is reaped without any results of pain is pure gain to happiness. Every act whose results of pain are less than the results of pleasure is good to the extent of the balance in favor of happiness. Pleasure equals happiness, and happiness equals good. Yikes. I don't like where this is going. Pleasure, every act whereby pleasure is reaped is, all consequences apart, good. Ethics, Bentham therefore concludes, is the science of pleasure and pain, the study of means to achieve happiness, the showing how virtue and felicity are interchangeable terms. Anyone else getting ready for do what thou wilt is the whole of the law with this line of reasoning? Bentham thought that this business of morality was as simple as elementary mathematics or physics. As Newton had worked out formulas with matter and motion, so Bentham thought that he could work out formulas with pain and pleasure. Most of his work on this subject is summed up in his De Ontology, the province of which he tells the reader is to teach him proper arithmetic, to lay before him a proper estimate of pain and pleasure, a budget of receipt and disbursement, out of every operation of which he is to draw a balance of good. He goes on, vice may be defined to be a miscalculation of chances, a mistake in estimating the value of pleasures and pains. It is a false moral arithmetic. And there is the consolation of knowing that by application of a right standard, there are few moral questions which may be not resolved with an accuracy and a certainty not far removed from mathematical demonstration. So I don't necessarily think like the liberal do-gooder culture is necessarily utilitarian or Benthamite, but I remember learning in contrast to what I was taught by my parents, like in society, this idea again about welfare. Like nobody wants to be on welfare. Nobody wants to be on the dole if they only understand, they're just not, they don't have an opportunity or they're traumatized, this kind of thing. And I can hear it in this, and it does remove free will. It is kind of contingent on there not being free will. So Bentham worked out a table of pleasures and pains, much like a logarithmic table in the back of an elementary trigonometry book. He drew up a list of 14 simple pleasures of sense, wealth, amity, skill, and power, for example. Power is a simple pleasure. And 12 simple pains, such as privation, enmity, and memory. Lists certainly not devised on any scientific, logical plan. These pleasures and pains, he goes on to show, are all of the same quality. They differ only in duration, intensity, certainty, proximity, extent, purity, and fecundity, like how much they produce. Such or procreate. Such an analysis of pleasure and pain shows how little Bentham knew of human nature. The table might appeal to a mathematician, but it would appall anyone who had even the slightest knowledge of men. Underlying this philosophic calculus is Bentham's narrow view of man as a robot equipped with a mechanical mind, powered by love of pleasure and fear of pain. Bentham never knew how noble or how mean man could be. That is why Nietzsche thrust viciously at Bentham by observing, man does not desire happiness, only the Englishman does. That's very interesting. What transcends culture, really, truly culture? And I think you would only be able to understand that if you were bilingual from birth and exposed to what the nuances of the language, because I think you get so much out of that, which is why Russian is so hard to translate, I think, into like the greatness of Russian literature. Maybe cannot be appreciated by someone who does not speak Russian natively. Okay. Legislation is therefore an easy science for the utilitarians, the science which they took most seriously and which they considered a sure means of bringing utopia to this miserable world. The simple problem of the legislator is to apply proper legal sanctions to certain acts so as to put an equal sign between private happiness and general welfare, which consists of the happiness of all people. All the legislator need do is keep Bentham's table of sanctions in one hand and his felicific, as in felicity, calculus in the other. Then he is to attach to all those acts which are criminal, and these are found to be criminal by the fact that they cause more pain in the community than happiness, such sanctions that the happiness the potential criminal would receive from committing the crime is overbalanced by the punishment attached to it. Stealing, for example, must be so punished that the thief's enjoyment of the stolen goods is nullified by the pain of punishment he receives under the law. Of course, you have to factor in the perception of the risk of punishment, by the way. That's my comment. All the legislator need do then is analyze the extent, duration, intensity, and such of the pain caused in the community by stealing. Against this, he must balance the pleasure the thief receives. If the pain suffered by the community outweighs the pleasure enjoyed by the thief, then stealing is immoral, and a physical sanction must be attached to it by law so that the potential thief will suffer more pain than he will gain pleasure from the act. It's really his perception of the pain. So you'd have to have the thing, if it's a 1 in 10 chance of getting caught, you'd have to have his punishment be 10 times of the what it would be if he were guaranteed to be caught. Okay. Bentham firmly believes that this will end all stealing as soon as men's minds are adjusted to work the right way. That's why they would cut your hand off, right? And plus, it's cheaper than putting you in jail. It will always be possible, of course, for the potential thief to miscalculate his pleasure and pain and thus to become a criminal. But education will reduce such miscalculations to a negligible factor. So will public execution, which, I mean, that's an easier way to do it. I'm not advocating that, of course. Okay. English law was in such a chaotic condition in Bentham's day. There was so much need for reform, and Bentham had done so much work on codification of the law that his name became almost synonymous with legal reform in his country. His disciples soon pushed the matter so vigorously in Parliament that they began to drive wedges in the antiquated bulwark of English criminal and civil law. And they did so under Bentham's coaching. In 1828, Brougham opened up the campaign in Parliament with a 6-hour speech, which he had prepared in consultation with Bentham. 10 years later, he claimed that 55 of the 60 reforms he had advocated in 1828 were adopted. In that first speech, he declared that Bentham was the world's first legal philosopher, and that the age of law reform and the age of Jeremy Bentham were interchangeable terms. Certainly, it is true that Bentham was the guiding light of the law reform group in Parliament in those days, that the reform was salutary, that much humanitarian legislation in England received its impetus from this rather inhuman group of utilitarians. Bentham's work on penology that's the penal system, took up as much of his time and interest as did his law reform. Here he gained attention for spreading the ideas of Montesquieu and Beccaria through the English-speaking world, but Bentham dresses them up in his own terminology and arranges them in his peculiar tables. Punishment, he insists, should not be vindictive. Its aim is not to make the criminal pay for his crime, but rather to use him as an example in order to discourage future potential criminals. Punishment is preventative, then, rather than vindictive. To serve this purpose, it must therefore be administered publicly. It must be certain and impartial. It must be proportioned to the crime, and it must outweigh the pleasure that the crime promises. Jails, he concludes, are for the rehabilitation of criminals, not for their confinement and suffering. Criminals are imprisoned in order to be ground honest and taught a trade, and thus to be sent out into the world, useful citizens, units of productive labor. Typical of Bentham's mentality is his view on condemning men to hard labor in prison. The policy of thus giving a bad name to industry, the parent of wealth and population, and setting it up as a scarecrow to frighten criminals with is what I must confess I cannot enter into the spirit of. I can see no use of making it either odious or infamous. To me, it would seem but so much better if a man could be taught to love labor instead of being taught to loathe it. Occupation, instead of the prisoner's scourge, should be called and should be made as much as possible a cordial to him. It is in itself a sweet in comparison with forced idleness, and the produce of it will give a double savor. Industry is a blessing. Why paint it as a curse? He opposed hard labor in prison, then, not for man's sake, but for hard labor's sake. He loved work more than he did the working man. See, this is the same thing with Calvin. And you have to wonder, these guys aren't the smartest guys in the world, yet it's their ideas that are promoted. And why? Like this guy, Thomas Neal, he touches on it for sure, but this stuff is promoted because it's serving whoever's in power at the time. And then it builds on it. So they remain in power, do they not? And these principles, which I think they still learn about in ivory towers, are like, they're heirloom wisdom. And by they, I mean, like literally these industrialists whose family names are on the buildings or not on the buildings if they're really smart, because we know the hidden life is best. They do learn this stuff. I was on the Higher Side Chats recently. It was so fun and such an honor. And Greg asked me if when I was in these Ivy League schools, like what I get, like what what's the skinny? And I will say that the people who came from those really elite high schools and had names on the top of buildings, they understood how to influence people and how to see what was coming. And they think of things like this. I mean, for sure. Part 5. Economics was a big thing with the utilitarians, for through this science were revealed vistas of a better world. They were not alone, of course, in looking so hopefully at the new science of economics, since theirs were exciting times economically. The Industrial Revolution was getting well underway, and England was leading the world in the new race for wealth. Yeomen had long been flocking into the cities where they worked the new machines to turn out all sorts of finished products, making their employers ever richer and themselves ever more miserable. Much wealth was being produced, but there were still famine and hunger, poverty and cold, misery and want, resulting from an absolute shortage of goods. The problem of production had by no means been licked in 1800. Of course, like I think that we need to go back to where if there is something you want to put your money in rather than gold or stocks or Bitcoin, have figure out how much land it takes to grow the potatoes that you need and the chickens that you need, and you don't have a production problem, like a fundamental production problem. And when you separate people from the land, that relationship, that ratio, plus the access to it becomes it can be problematic. You got to work all that stuff out, and then you are also vulnerable. Here was a subject, this business of producing and distributing wealth, to which the utilitarians could turn their organizing, systematizing, codifying minds. And they did, with a gusto and a sureness which today seem amazing. They plunged into this business to find the same kind of laws Newton had found in the physical world and Mill had found in the world of the mind. The first such law they found was Malthus's Law of Population, first published in 1798 and republished with strong supporting evidence in 1803. This was an ideal law for the utilitarians. It was so conclusive since it was started in arithmetic and geometric ratios, then all the rage. It was so imposing because of the mass of evidence accumulated to support it. It was so comforting and consoling since it assured the Benthamites that neither they nor anyone else was responsible for the misery and suffering they saw everywhere about them. The key thesis of Malthus's essay on population can be stated simply. Population increases unless it is checked somehow at a geometric ratio, whereas the means of subsistence increase at an arithmetic ratio. So population increases geometrically, food basically arithmetically, which is much less. Okay, the results are frightening. In 1 century, Malthus pointed out, the population would be 32 times what it was then. In 2 centuries, it would be 1,000 times. In 3 centuries, 33,000 times. After that, it would seem there just isn't room for men to sit down on this earth. Meanwhile, food increases so slowly. In the year 2003, Malthus pointed out, 256 people would have to live on what was consumed by 9 in 1803. Gosh, I would love to look at his numbers and see how they compare to reality, like honestly. Plus, we had what was called the Green Revolution in the 60s, where that guy, I forget his name, increased the yield of land by something like 4 times. They say, though, his improvements over time, like in third world countries, lost their benefit, but interrupted that heirloom wisdom that had been passed down from generation to generation, that were culturally specific, right from right here on this land. This is how we do things. People forget. Frightening me, says Malthus didn't factor in the increases in efficiency. That's absolutely true. And yield. You think, well, it's just dirt. How can it yield more? Absolutely can yield more. But it was an inescapable fact that such a formidable increase of population had not occurred in the past. This is true, Malthus claims, because of checks nature has imposed on mankind's fruitfulness. poverty, vice, disease, famine, war, and so on. The vices of mankind, he explains, are active and able ministers of depopulation. You can see this guy's tendrils. Yeah, that's what the Malthus is probably the most well known as, like, being behind the satanic forces that rule the world. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction and often finish the work themselves. But should they fail in the war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off their thousands and 10,000s. So first you want war, then you want pestilence. So first you want whatever is coming, and then but more, I think COVID, killing people that way, in the report from Iron Mountain, says it's better because you're not killing the young and healthy like you do in war. You're killing the old and infirm. Should success still be incomplete, gigantic, inevitable famine stalks in the rear and at one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world. Mankind, therefore, is condemned to live on a minimum essential diet. For when there is extra food, more babies will survive until the food is leveled off to the population. When there are extra babies, then some must starve till the population is leveled off to the food supply. This is a rather disturbing situation. Is there no way of improving man's lot here on this earth of limited food supply? Malthus has one and only one solution. His famous, quote, moral check. Men can limit their offspring by marrying late in life. Sound familiar? By not marrying at all if they do not have good prospects of supporting a family, or if they must marry, by limiting the size of their families. The only solution, Malthus therefore concludes, another thing you could do is encourage homosexuality or messing with your genitals by transitioning to a sex that would not be fertile for you. So like all these things are being promoted right now. You can see it. The only solution, but why? Because the powers that be think we can't be fed? No, it's because they know that we can't be controlled at great numbers in traditional ways. I think probably AI or modulating everything, making everything modular, or firing all government employees and replacing them with robots is probably more scalable. The only solution, Malthus therefore concludes, is the exercise on the part of the poor of prudence in marriage and of economy both before and after it. In this way, Malthus sweeps away all attempts to tackle the problem of poverty unless through limiting the population. So he must have hated Catholics. I see no way, he writes, which man can escape from the weight of this law which pervades all animated nature. Were I to propose a palliative, and palliatives are all that the nature of the case will admit, it should be a total abolition of all the present forms of relief, like welfare, anything that keeps people alive. In the report from Iron Mountain, it said giving kids who have cancer treatment just perpetuates the genes that give kids cancer. Yikes. I mean, these people are devoid of inherent morality. Okay, this law then is more than a scientifically established fact. It is a moral argument justifying poverty and suffering, for which, indeed, neither the government nor the employer is at all responsible. The conclusions to which the law of population mathematically led the Benthamites were inescapable. The state has no choice but to adopt a social laissez-faire policy. By trying to relieve poverty, it would only increase the population and thus level more people down to the margin of subsistence. By letting the poor alone and by allowing them to starve themselves out of their miserable existence, it would teach them to help themselves or to perish, which they must eventually do anyway. Relief or no relief. The poor, therefore, must be satisfied with their hard lot. Their only chance to obtain a few luxuries is to remain unmarried, or if they must marry prudently, to trim their families to their income. What Malthus did for the problem of population and poverty, Ricardo did for the more technical phases of economics. Yes, this is interesting. Everything in business he showed with mathematical certainty follows inescapable laws involving men, money, machines, and raw material. All these factors, man included, move through Ricardo's pages. Arturo, I have to do this. Arturo. Hey, Arturo. Hey, come here. Well, if, now you have to come get him. Someone's talking to him through the door. Archer, come here. Come here. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Now you have to lay down, down. Hey, down, lay, lay, lay. Good boy. Good boy. Okay, for the audio listeners, I'm definitely editing that out, and I'm grateful for you live listeners for sticking with me here. Okay. Yes, Ricardo. So he said all these factors, man included, move through Ricardo's pages as the planets move through Newton's Principia. As matter blindly obeys the law of gravity and is attracted to other matter in proportion to their weight, so man is blindly attracted to profit in proportion to the number of dollars involved and in reverse ratio to the risk he runs. This economic man of Ricardo is Bentham's human calculating machine, who seems to have put one equal sign between pleasure and profit and another between pain and loss. This economic man is a rationalist robot that coldly calculates all factors involved in a problem, weighs alternatives, and then automatically selects the choice which is most profitable. The material with which the economic man works are nice, clear-cut blocks labeled capital, labor, value, utility, rent, wages, profit, and so on. Each one of these items is seen in rationalistic fashion as a clear and distinct entity with an independent existence. It enters into relationships with the other items according to certain easily found and clearly defined laws. This economic science, therefore, becomes exceedingly abstract and mathematically exact, so that the reader of utilitarian economic textbooks begins to wonder whether it is a science created arbitrarily in the utilitarian mind with definitions, rules, and all imposed by the mind, or whether it is supposed to have some relation to the mass of men sweating in the coal mines of Wales or toiling in the factories of Manchester. Its scientific appearance, however, did not hide the fact that the arguments were also moral and reformist. Moral because they justified individualistic capitalism and its abuses. Reformist because they advocated sweeping away the remnants of English mercantilism and protectionism. This is interesting to me because I was an economics major. I was raised a libertarian, was also raised a Catholic, and I have a book, The Church and the Libertarian or something. These kind of calculations, I'm not saying the law needs to be involved, but justifying it philosophically and morally is not okay. Like denying a man a just wage is not is immoral. You're not allowed to do it. So you need to apply your own morals to the liberty of your government or whatever. Like you absolutely have to. So I'm fine with saying it's not a place for coercion, but don't tell me that it's right. That it's for the greater good and that makes it right. It's not for the greater good. The premises are mistaken largely, and it's the wrong, it perpetuates the problem. Apparently, the new economics was supposed to explain what real men were doing in the factories and mines and why they were doing it. The explanation was best given, all Benthamites agreed, by David Ricardo in his Principles of Political Economy. I'm sure I have that from school. And taxation, which Mill finally got him to publish in 1817. This work became the economic Bible of the utilitarians, a Bible which was put in simple form by James Mill in a schoolbook of political economy and was revised some decades later by John Stuart Mill. The most famous of Ricardo's laws, certainly the one most closely associated with his name and with utilitarians generally, was his, quote, iron law of wages. The natural price of labor, it runs, is that price which is necessary to enable the laborers, one with another, to subsist and perpetuate their race without either increase or diminution. So the natural price of labor is subsistence to the point where they can have children to replace themselves or to meet the needs of the society, but not so many that it interferes with that they start to starve to death, Malthus style. Okay, yeah, here we go. This, coupled with Malthus's law of population, put the poor man forever in his place. For if higher wages are paid, workers will have larger families. If the supply of workers increases, the employer will be able to bargain advantageously because the supply of labor will be above the demand and thus pay lower wages. Then some workers will starve until the employers find they are running short of labor, whereupon they will pay higher wages until the supply and demand level off again. So it goes on endlessly, with the worker always ending up just where he started. That is, barely keeping alive and barely perpetuating himself. You know what subsidizes capital in this, makes that wage lower? Public transportation and other kinds of subsidies. They're not to make the poor better off. They're to make the subsistence wage lower. That's to get people to work. I mean, I'm no socialist. I'm just saying my taxes are going towards that, which is a kind of fascism, in my opinion. Anyway, logically and inevitably, the Benthamites arrived at a laissez-faire stand and logically and inevitably, the Benthamites arrived at a laissez-faire stand on the state's role in society. All right, let's see what they got to say. They got there, as a matter of fact, by two different lines of reasoning, either of which was conclusive enough for them. Bentham believed that state interference with business was bad because pain is the general concomitant of the sense of such restraint. People don't like it, is I guess what he's saying. The others rejected state control of private enterprise on the grounds that it was both useless and pernicious. Useless because it was a vain attempt to interfere with physically determined laws like supply and demand, the setting of wages or rent, and so on. As vain as the attempt to change the law of gravity. Pernicious because such attempts always interfered with the proper working out of these laws by throwing up obstacles in their path. But this implies, like this labor at subsistence level, applies that labor has no power whatsoever. And I believe was this long after the plague? Were there any plagues after this? A lot of this, I don't know about this one, but the plague gave labor power. So I think labor has more power than they're implying. They're just not allowed to exercise it. It seems to me like you have union. Yeah. So they honeypot labor into unions and then they corrupt the unions, for example. Like that's what allows labor to continually be under the boot, I think. Okay. All government. See, so if for laissez-faire system, in my opinion, would work if it were, if unions weren't supported by government laws and stuff like that. They'd have to actually fight it out and win over through their merits the organization. Okay. All government, Bentham solemnly proclaimed, is in itself one vast evil. He therefore insisted that best results were obtained in society when men agree that, quote, the general rule is that nothing ought to be done or attempted by the government. He argues for a policeman state in which the government is only to preserve order, guarantee property rights, make sure that men do not murder one another. That's minarchism. And I've got to say, I love that at the federal level, especially. I don't know. I hate to be on Bentham's side for anything, but security and freedom are all that industry requires, he tells us. The request which agriculture, manufactures, and commerce present to governments is modest and reasonable as that which Diogenes made to Alexander. Stand out of my sunshine. This comparison was meant literally. When Parliament was debating a bill to prohibit children from working more than 10 hours a day, The Economist, the magazine, presenting the utilitarian's viewpoint, ran the headline, "The Lords leagued with the Commons to prohibit industry." I will say this, though. I know it sounds like the guy from Parks and Recreation saying like child labor laws ruin this country. But if you were starving and you were 11 years old, yeah, do I think they should have used them to change the machinery and potentially cut their fingers off? No, but I don't know. Anyway, I do think that the laissez-faire government would actually work, but many times the government came in, like with pollution and stuff, they came in and they made laws that favored industry. So I don't need them to make laws that favor labor. I don't need the welfare or anything, but I need laws that I want them not to do the opposite. Uh, because the industry they favor is not cottage industry. It's not what you can do. And if you're, there's no reason for super huge companies. There's no reason for high profit margins. A business, a company, a factory will be as big as the most efficient unit. And then entrants will come into the industry and drive those profits down to where labor and capital are employed at their like marginal best use. And that's very egalitarian. I think we had that in the 19th century, and you had labor wages, I believe, outpacing productivity gains and no inflation whatsoever. Inflation is how they absorb that without you realizing it because you're making less, even though the number is the same. So anyway, I think my economics is coming out here, but I'm definitely not Bentham's ideas generally I don't like. Okay. Section 6. Unswerving faith in democracy. Oh, Frightening Me says, never heard the iron law of wages brought up with the immigration debate. Good one. Unswerving faith in democracy came to be an article in the Utilitarian Creed in rather curious fashion. Bentham, as we have seen, had long been a Tory. His only interest was to see the greatest possible number of mankind receive the greatest possible measure of pleasure and suffer the minimum amount of pain. For many years, he thought that he could accomplish this by showing the ruling classes how to promote the people's happiness. But when he found himself whistling in the wind, when he discovered Tories and Whigs were not so benevolent as he had thought, he concluded that democracy was a prerequisite to his grand reform projects. Bentham himself never worked out a theoretical defense of popular government. It was implied, however, in his later work on law reform and in specific changes he advocated in the government. It remained for James Will to work out the utilitarian theory of government. This he presented in an article on government, which appeared in the 1820 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. This article was for the utilitarian political theory, what Ricardo's book was for their economics. It was gospel truth from which no orthodox Benthamite dared deviate. So inviolable did they hold its truths, indeed, that Macaulay taunted them for holding it perfect and unanswerable. 50 years later, John Stuart could still call his father's article a masterpiece of political wisdom, although he had himself written incomparably more wisely on the same subject. Mill begins his article by asserting that the end of government is the increase of human happiness, as in the purpose of government is to increase human happiness. It is essentially an association into which men enter for the protection of their lives and their property. The big problem presented by the existence of governments, therefore, is to prevent them, once they are given the power to protect us, from plundering us instead. Power must be given to the government to protect, and the danger always exists of that power being turned against the people from whom it came. This dilemma of government, Mill tells his readers, has been solved by the grand discovery of modern times, representative government. For the community at large cannot, following the utilitarian principle of selfishness, have any interest opposed to its own happiness. So the only problem is to obtain a government truly representative of the people, because such a government is prevented by the very nature of things from making the people unhappy. Politics was as simple to Mill as psychology, and both were as simple as elementary arithmetic. Proper mechanical devices are to achieve true representation. First, the vote should be extended as widely as possible because, in Bentham's words, every person is not only the best, but the only proper judge of what, with reference to himself, is pleasure and what pain. I mean, that's crazy. Because if you have 51 people who like it one way, if 51 people like beating people up and 49 people don't because they're small and skinny, do you really want a vote on whether it's okay to beat people up? Anyway, each man must therefore have the right to vote for one who can most accurately represent him in Parliament. Second, the representatives should be elected frequently, annually, Bentham held, so as to be held closely accountable for their work in Parliament. I don't think that's terrible. Bentham and his followers added some features to Mill's proposals: abolition of the House of Lords, since it is not truly representative of the people, secret ballot to ensure free voting and thus more accurate representation, redistricting to afford people actual rather than virtual representation in commons. You know, with the federal government being so big and powerful, should we I'm not proposing this, but if you had 400 congressional races that were national, like you were represented not by your divided county, but by your aligned interests. You know, like if there's 2% of every vote for every congressman is libertarian, you would get a few libertarians elected if it were divided that way. I kind of got that idea from The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Do you remember that one? Okay. For rather poor reasons, the utilitarians were for good government. The democracy they advocated came in time to be adopted in England, and though it was a distinct improvement on the government by a privileged few of days gone by, it never realized utilitarian expectations. The majority has proved it too can err. It can be as tyrannical and selfish as an aristocratic minority. The Benthamites concluded logically from their deterministic view of man that good machinery of government will make men good and happy simply by operating automatically according to the laws of its and man's nature. Stephen can therefore conclude of Mill's essay on government that he is not less certain that a good constitution will make men virtuous than was Bentham that he could grind rogues honest by panopticon. John Stuart Mill offered much better arguments for democracy than either his father or Bentham, but by then, 1871, the victory of democracy was already assured. Religion was one subject on which the utilitarians felt strongly but dared not talk freely. Suspected for their social and political radicalism, they could not risk their cause by a direct attack on religion. Instead, they, quote, contented themselves, as Stephen puts it, with sapping the fort instead of risking an assault. To avoid scandalizing the servants, they employed code words for religious terms in their discussions at home, using juggernaut, for example, to mean Christianity. Wow, funny. So when they were talking, they didn't want like the butlers and the maids and stuff to know that they were agnostic or atheistic or undermining religion. So they used code words. Wow. Hey, we should do that with the thingy. The thingy that's in your pocket that glows and listens all the time. Their views on religion were strong. It was, they held, nothing but a sedative to keep people submissive. They insisted that the established Church of England was a means whereby the sinister interests controlling the government kept people diverted from obtaining happiness on earth by hanging huge slices of pie high in the sky for their rapt contemplation. So if you think that the king is standing in your way of being a rich oligarch, you're going to be against the hierarchy, even though you're an aspiring member of the secret elite. So, like, these aren't people who don't like the monarchy because they're for labor necessarily. Like the French Revolution, they say, was absolutely behind the scenes. And these revolutions always have like a back revolution. They'd like 10 years later, somebody else swoops in and gets the power. So I wouldn't give them too much credit for that. Okay, their one direct attack on religion was a little book written by Philip Beauchamp, a combination of Jeremy Bentham and George Grote. This work, John Stuart Mill points out correctly in his autobiography, was an examination not of the truth, but of the usefulness of religious belief. Nevertheless, the conclusion was that if religious belief was not useful, it must be false. On the utilitarian standard of pleasure and pain, Beauchamp undertakes a devastating rationalistic analysis of the worth of religion. By religion, he tells his reader, he means a belief in the existence of an almighty being by whom pains and pleasures will be dispensed to mankind during an infinite and future state of existence. Such a belief is purely gratuitous, he insists, since no one can have experienced this afterlife, and there is no other way of knowing about it. Well, people say they have. You just don't believe them. Religious belief is good or bad, consequently, according to the amount of pleasure or pain it brings to believers in this life. If it orders men to do what is good and useful, Beauchamp's argument runs, it is unnecessary, for then it merely coincides with human reason and with rational legislation. It does not even offer additional assurance that these useful precepts will be obeyed, for its sanction is too remote and too uncertain to be effective. One who will murder in the face of the hangman's knot will not flinch before far off and not very probable hellfire. If, on the other hand, religion orders men to do what is not useful, it is on that account vicious, like a vice. So at best, it is useless. At worst, it is vicious. Beauchamp then proceeds to show that religion causes mankind more pain than pleasure on this earth. The consolation it offers an afflicted heart are meager, but the dread of eternal suffering it stirs up in their minds truly causes misery. The picture of hell is more vivid than the picture of heaven. No one can really enjoy the prospect of heaven, but the fear of hell can cause men a lifetime of frightful anguish. The Christian concept of God is repulsively vicious, Beauchamp argues, for the God of the Christians is a capricious tyrant who makes all men suffer, who slays the innocent and rewards the wicked, who makes man weak and then places him amidst unavoidable pitfalls. Christianity, therefore, produces all sorts of evils, which Beauchamp catalogs something like this. It demands useless, painful practices such as fasting, celibacy, self-torture. It suggests terrors which drive many persons to the verge of insanity. It denies men the enjoyment of many innocent pleasures. It divides men against men, condemns innocent persons to social banishment, perverts morality by substituting capricious standards for the true one of utility, and finally, it arrests intellectual progress. These strictures against religion are as close as the utilitarians ever come to passionate argument. But even here, there is the appearance of vigorous, unflinching reasoning rather than emotional rhetoric. The God against whom they argued was not, as they seem to have thought, the God of the established Anglican Church. It was rather the God of Calvin and Knox, to whom James Mill had been introduced in his studies for the ministry of Scotland. It was the God whom extremist dissenters called down upon the utilitarians for their hedonism. It was therefore the God this agnostic group could most easily observe as the almighty sovereign of English believers. Section 7. Okay, so this is usually where he tells you how it applies to the modern world. The utilitarians were a small, unpopular sect in their day. On all sides, they were shunned because of their personalities and because of their doctrines. They were a cold, self-righteous group, utterly contemptuous of any benighted fool who differed from their systematically worked out theories. And their ideas were stated bluntly, coldly, unflinchingly. No attempt was made to sell them to the English public. They were simply propounded as absolute truth, and anyone who did not take them up was scorned. They were indeed a strange combination of rationalist and Puritan. They threw philosophy overboard, but they kept the philosophers' faith in reason. They threw the Puritans' God overboard, but they kept the Puritans' social virtues. They eulogized labor and the industrial system. They exalted prudence, frugality, and sharp dealing with one's neighbor. And all the while, they held to that hedonistic morality which only the aristocrats they despised knew how to practice. They were intellectually convinced that pleasure was the sole good in life, but they were temperamentally incapable of experiencing any pleasure but that of being right. Utilitarian ideas were even less popular than utilitarians, for they were dangerous, and dangerous ideas are never popular. They advocated republicanism, which in 1800 was almost as radical as communism was a century later. They held rigidly to such ironclad economic principles as Malthus's law of population and Ricardo's iron law of wages. And for this, they were scouted by aristocrats. Whigs and socialists alike, they were suspected of atheism. And for this, they were feared by all respectable Christians, which included almost everyone else in England. Unpopular as their ideas were, they nevertheless made headway throughout the 19th century, partly because of the utilitarians themselves, and partly because of the march of events over which they had no control. Their influence in the next two generations, Bertrand Russell maintains, was astonishingly great, considering their complete absence of emotional appeal. It is certainly true that they were prime movers in pushing many a good cause which other parties, notably the Whigs, later took up. Bentham and his associates did more than any other group to convince the Englishman that his laws needed codifying and his penal system overhauling. And all through the 19th century, Whig vied with Tory in bringing about these sorely needed reforms. The Benthamites pushed such radical proposals as universal manhood suffrage, vote by ballot, frequent elections, and equitable representation, all of which came to be accepted when they were no longer radical. On the other hand, they pushed a laissez-faire attitude on the part of government towards industry and commerce. And in time, this too was realized, though with such non-Benthamite compromises as legal limitation of child labor. More important in the long run than these practical reforms, perhaps, were the attitudes and theories which they helped generate. They played an important role in breaking the English-speaking world away from its philosophical past and putting it on the road of frank pragmatism. The Anglo-Saxon temperament was pragmatically inclined for centuries, it is true. But the Benthamites worked out an intellectual defense for this way of life as the only good way. They were themselves utilitarian rather than pragmatic, but it is only a short step from the former to the latter. Their utilitarian case was rested upon man's being inveterately selfish, and thus they furthered that individualism which becomes more and more prominent through each decade of the past century and a half. That was Ayn Rand's thing, the virtue of selfishness. Now, I think a lot of people think she was whatever a Rothschild agent. I'm not going to argue, but yeah, these are ideas that have their value to the people who propagate these ideas for their own benefits. Unfortunately, at the very time when the Benthamites were pushing individualism, they were freeing the individual of human responsibility for his acts. See, that's important. As rationalists, they insisted that all wrong is the result of intellectual misapprehension, that such things as murder or bank robbery are caused by some human calculating machine getting out of gear and coming out with a wrong answer in its philosophic calculus. As environmental determinists, they fell victim to that modern disease of institutionalists, which is still so strongly with us. Good government, good business, good family relationships, good living can be achieved, institutionalists believe, simply and solely by getting the right kind of machinery. No room is left in their minds for the men who operate the machine. It is the machine alone that counts. And in this regard, I will say that their idea of change the world and you change the man, the level of dumbing people down and using propaganda makes them more vulnerable than ever to really things that do not comport with their own lifelong sensibilities, like the Bill of Rights. How many people who, like the Trump administration, talk about the Bill of Rights? Like none. Government efficiency is the enemy of the Bill of Rights. I do not want an efficient government. I want a hogtied government. Anyway, the blind trust in cooperatives, proportional representation, unicameral legislatures, or the right curriculum in college is a faith that one finds logically held by utilitarians. And they denied man any faculty not possessed by the machinery of which he was a cog. He was to them a mechanism that they had taken apart and studied so expertly that they knew exactly what made him tick. The utilitarians were the world's last influential group of rationalists. It is unfortunate that they were so naive in their trust in reason that they left no proper place for emotion or caprice, for heroism or villainy, because their barren brand of rationalism tended to discredit man's very reason. The mechanical robot they thought man to be was an unlovable machine. He was utterly selfish. His wheels were turned by love of pleasure and fear or pain alone. He was an unromantic machine indeed. A world reformed along Benthamite lines and run according to Bentham's standards would be a dreary, dismal place. It would be a lone shark's world, or at best, a world where everyone was his own bookie, calculating the odds on every choice and making his every move in perfect accordance with what the odds dictated. Men would move like the planets through the universe, except that by figuring out their own laws of motion, they would be self-steering bodies. James Mill's eldest son, honest John Stewart, saw how barren and unsavory and incorrect Jeremy Bentham's naive rationalism was. He tried to wed it to the feeling he found deep inside of man by substituting a higher utility for Bentham's and his father's simple utilitarianism. He tried to modify Benthamite psychology, morality, political science, and economics, but his attempt was vain. The flood of German voluntarism and subjectivism engendered by Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and their associates engulfed poor John Stewart and cut short his strong influence in England. Even more ironic and more pathetic from the younger Mill's point of view was the rise of two movements that came logically from his father's own doctrines, movements usually associated with the names of Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. Socialism was an infant when utilitarianism was putting on long pants for the first time. But the baby dared to ask for his share of the pie, which he thought his big brother was unjustly keeping all to himself. William Thompson of Cork, for example, argued against the Benthamites that if Ricardo's theory of value were true, laborers were being cheated of their just wages, and Thomas Hodgkins answered Ricardo's famous work with Labor Defended Against the Claims of Capital, in which he argued logically that if labor creates all value, then all the returns of production should go to the working man, that what the landowner and entrepreneur and capitalist withhold is robbery. The labor theory of value, I'm not fully on board. I understand it. I just can't. I'm too much of a libertarian. I'm sorry. I think it has value, and I think that its value is suppressed. What it gets is suppressed by laws, by government force. That I do believe. Darwinism, like socialism, derives logically from utilitarian doctrine. As a matter of historic fact, Darwin's theory on the survival of the fittest by natural selection was suggested to the famous biologist from his accidental reading of Malthus's essay on population. That explains a lot. If population is always pressing against the food supply, it follows that people are constantly struggling with each other for food and for survival. What are the laws determining who will get the food and survive? Darwin proposed to discover why and how some survive while others do not. And Darwin's followers worked out a theory of individual and class competition that was the utilitarian theory of business competition with no holds barred. Dang it, I have one sentence left. The Benthamites, Arturo, the Benthamites are therefore important as makers of the modern mind, both for their own contributions to modern mentality and for occupying a transitional position, giving way logically to socialism on the one hand and Darwinism on the other. Thank you, everyone. I gotta go. Thank you for coming. I can't wait till next time. Darwin, struggle for survival.